All right. This next section is, you can write this down in your notes if you'd like. This section is 1.5, chapter 1.5. And it goes over a few things. The title of the section is Midpoint and Bisectors, and we'll get into those things in a second. But first, I want to just show you something real quick. Let's say we had a number line. And let's just say that this number line went from -10 to 10. And then 0 was here in the middle. And maybe 5 is here, or -5 is here, excuse me, and 5 is here. And then we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, -1, -2, -3, -4, -5, so on and so forth. And let's say I asked you what the midpoint of -4 and actually, you know what? Let's do this. Let's do the midpoint of +4 and -2, which is right here. If I asked you what the midpoint was, what do you think the midpoint is? Well, yes, as I'm sure you have figured it out. The midpoint is the point that is directly between those points. So here's -2. Here's 4. And if I were to ask you for the midpoint, I would be asking you for the point that is exactly between those. Now, there's a couple of ways to find this midpoint. First, we can just count. There is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 slots between -2 and 4. So the midpoint is going to be exactly halfway between them. And so 6 divided by 2, or 6 times 1/2, is 3. So I need to go 3 away from either of these. So if I go 3 away from 4, that is 1. And if I go 3 away from -2, that is 1. So 1 is the midpoint, right? And we would call this M. We call it midpoints M. Okay, there's also a way to do this mathematically. If I just take these two values, -2 and 4, and I just add them together and then divide by 2. This should look familiar to you. Why am I dividing by 2? Because there's 2 of these values. If I was finding the midpoint between 3, I could add them together and divide by 3. This is the same as an average. You've seen this before when finding the average between two numbers. That's essentially what we're doing, is we are finding the average. So I would write that out. It's the same as average. And when we're finding the midpoint, we're essentially finding the average between those two values. And so we'll continue to do this work. -2 plus 4 is, oh, sorry, let me do this. I'll come over here. -2 plus 4 is +2, and +2 over 2 is 1. So when we find the midpoint this way, it actually tells us the exact value of the midpoint. Okay. Well, sometimes we use midpoint. What if we don't just have 2 points on an x-axis, right? This is like the equivalent of the x direction moving positively and negatively in the x direction. What if I have both my coordinates are given in x and y values? So I have an x1, y1, and I have an x2, y2. How could I find the midpoint of those 2 points? It's actually very intuitive, and we're going to get to it here. So we just talked loosely about what midpoint was in general, kind of a way to describe it. The actual midpoint formula is this right here. And it's just exactly what we did, but both with the x and the y values. I take the x values of the 2 points. So if we have 2 points, we have A and we have B. I'm going to take those 2 points, add the x values together, divide by 2, add the y values together, divide by 2. That will be M, which will be midpoint, and it will most oftentimes be a new x value, which we can call x3, and a new y value, which we can call x3. So we're going to do a couple examples. Find the midpoint of -4, 0, and 3, 8. This is point A. This is point B. So we're just going to follow this exact formula. The two x values are -4 and 3. So I'm going to add those two together, divide by 2. And that's going to be the new x value. And then y value will be 0 plus 8, which is the two y values. Here's y1 and here's y2. And I'll actually write those up. There's x1, there's y1, there's x2, and there's y2. Remember, coordinates or points for coordinates for points are always listed as an x value and then comma a y value. So the midpoint for the y values is going to be both of the y values added together divided by 2. So let's do this math over here. -4 plus 3 is going to be -1 over 2. All right, and we can just leave it like that. You can write 0.5 if you'd like, but this is as simplified as it gets. So the average of the x values is -1/2, and 0 plus 8 is 8. 8 divided by 2 is 4. So our midpoint, the point that is directly between A and B here, A being -4, 0, and B being 3, 8, the point that is directly between them, which we will call M, is -1/2, comma 4. So if you were to plot it out, you could plot these points, and you would see that this point is exactly between them. Let's do another example really quickly before moving on. Find P of segment PQ if Q is -3, -1, and midpoint M is 3, -4. Okay, now this is a little bit different because it's actually telling us what the midpoint is. So we already know the midpoint, and it's asking us for P, which is an endpoint. So I'm gonna draw this out. It's a segment, so we know it's gonna look like this. Okay, and it's segment PQ. So this is P, this is Q, and then we have a midpoint, a point directly between them, which we'll call M. Here's the thing. I'm gonna write that so it's a little neater. Here's the thing. We know the values for M and for Q. We know that Q is -3, comma 1, or sorry, excuse me, comma -1, and we know that M is 3, comma -4, and it's asking us for this the values for this point P. Let's think about how we would do this for a second. I'm going to give you just a second to kind of think to yourself about what your strategy would be to try and figure out what that value is. Okay, so hopefully you've had a little bit of time to think, and what I would do is I would just write an equation. So I know that x1 plus x2 divided by 2 is going to be the x value for the midpoint. Okay, is going to be the x value for the midpoint. Well, we know that the x value for the midpoint here is 3. It tells us this. The x value for the midpoint M is 3. So when I add the two x's together and divide by 2, I'm going to get 3. But here's the other thing. I actually know what one of those x's is. We know that x2, which is the x value for this endpoint right here, is -3. Now this is an equation that I can solve. This is an equation that I can actually do math with and I can solve. So what would we need to do? Well, I need to get this x by itself in order to find what this x value is. And so I need to multiply both sides by 2. Okay, and when I do that, this crosses out over here, and then I multiply that by 2. This 3 by 2, and what I get is I'm left with x1 plus a -3 is the same as x1 minus 3. And 3 times 2 is 6. And make sure you're following along with me as I write stuff down. You should be writing it in your notes as well. And then we just need to add 3 to both sides to get x1 by itself. And so x1 is 9. So are we done? No, because we still have to go back and do the y value. But we at least know that the x value for this point P is going to be 9. And now we need to go and do the y value as well. Okay, so I'm going to lower this right here. I'm going to come right here and do the y value. So what do we know about the y value? Well, we know that the y value for the midpoint is -4, and I know that when I add y1 plus y2 and divide it by 2, I will get -4. But once again, we know the second y value here, and we know that that second y value is -1, and then I just need to do some math. Once again, I'm going to multiply both sides by 2 to get rid of this fraction on the left side of this equation. Those will cross out. I have to do the same thing to this side, and what we're left with is y1 minus 1 equals -4 times 2 is -8. And I need to solve this. So I'll add 1 to both sides to get y1 by itself. And y1 is going to be -7. So there you go. So my x value for this point is 9 and my y value is -7. So this is going to be 9, -7. So that's a little bit more work, but you can do it. Even if you just know the midpoint and one of the endpoints, you can do the work to find the other endpoint. So it goes in both directions. Not only can I find the midpoint between 2 points, but I can also find an endpoint if I'm given the midpoint and one of the endpoints.